We got one more guest here for this Tuesday edition of the show. That is professional handicapper Ralph Michaels from WagerTalk.com. Ralph, how's it going today, man?
Doing well, Adam. Appreciate it.
All right, buddy. Good to have you on the program here once again, as always. And look, we spent a lot of time ranting and raving about week 2 to week 3 in the NFL, what we saw in week 2. Hey, college football, the picture's not super clear here either. Bad coaching, bad officiating, bad a lot of things here so far in the college football season. What were your major takeaways from week 3?
Well, a couple of the biggest surprises are our significant upsets we saw. Georgia Tech going down. We knew they were a team with only 9 starters changing schemes. The Kansas upset against Boston College. No matter how much you're not a Kansas fan, it's nice to see them perhaps turn the page. I don't know if one win we can see turn the page, but Les Miles seems that they're headed in the right direction. Arizona State's upset, some big upsets. And also, we're finding some early value because of what people overperceive very often early in the year. We've seen a lot of teams all of a sudden pop into the AP rankings, get a little big-headed. The other opponents have the game circled because they're ranked. Syracuse comes to mind, but there's been a few teams that have popped in and now have popped out. And lastly, the teams that have gotten outgained and won the week before are now only 8-15 against the spread. This week there are a handful of teams. The teams last week that won their game yet got outgained: Arizona State, BYU, California, App State, Wyoming, Penn State, Iowa, and Kansas State. So keep an eye if that trend continues. Again, teams, if you play them, if they won the game but got outgained the week before, they are 8-15 against the spread so far to start this year.
Well, as I've talked about, and as a lot of people have talked about here on the show, box score study, very important when it comes to adjusting power ratings and stuff like that. But also, without fail, every single week, if you see a team that won but got outgained, money comes in against them early in the week. Just because there is that misperception in the marketplace that does artificially inflate that number a little bit. So if you go through and study the box scores, take Michigan State, for example, here this week. Yeah, Michigan State lost to Arizona State. Should they have lost that game at home? No. They've taken money every week this season here so far, but they outgained Arizona State by 200 yards last week. So that's why their number goes from 6.5 to 9.5 or 10 for this week. You can find line value simply by doing box score study and finding those teams that lost but outgained the opposition or won but got outgained.
Yeah, well, another interesting team is Colorado. Colorado sits at 2-1, and they got outgained in all 3 games. Why are they 2-1 and lost in overtime last week? Well, because they're +7 turnovers. Teams that are +7 turnovers early in 3 games, those are the teams you want to look to fade. I remember going back to last season. You look at Kansas, and Kansas was a 3-9 team last year. They beat TCU later in the year, but why did they beat Central Michigan and Rutgers early? Well, they were +6 turnovers in both games. You look for those situations where a team shouldn't have won, but won the battle because of turnovers, like Colorado. We're not talking about this game, but I'll just continue on my train of thought. Even though I mentioned Arizona State as one of those teams that got outgained, I think the situation is much stronger fading Colorado. You can't get a more difficult scheduling spot. Playing your rival, Colorado State, in the Denver Broncos Stadium, you get outgained, but you're +4 turnovers, so you win that game and even cover. Nebraska, a game you're trailing, totally out of it. We talked about this last week. You throw a 96 or 98-yard flea flicker, you're back in the game. You got outgained, but you were plus turnovers and won. Air Force, you now face another in-state rival, the option. What do? You got outgained, you go to overtime, you do lose that game, and now you go on the road for your first road game, and it's a division foe that, oh yeah, by the way, has a damn good defense. So To me, the toughest scheduling spot in the entire country this week is Colorado off 2 in-state rivals and that Nebraska game.
And not only that, I mean, a tough road game at that. I mean, going to Tempe is not easy at all. It's a very, very good home field advantage. Late game, so the fans will be nice and liquored up. A lot of White Claws going on down there in Tempe this week. And also Arizona State now in the top 25, which, do they deserve to be there? I don't know. Probably not. But, still going to have a very raucous environment down there. My line on that game is 10.5. I'm kind of hoping for a 7 with reasonable juice. Probably not going to get it. Going to have to settle for 7.5. But I will be on Arizona State in that one. And speaking of the market, there are some shenanigans out there in the market this week. UCF, I mean, that line took off yesterday. Got as high as 14 at Bovada, 13.5 pretty much everywhere else in the offshore market. I grabbed 13.5 because it felt way too high. It's back down to 12 now. We saw Nebraska hit, I think Nebraska got all the way up to 14 at some places. That's coming back down a little bit. Utah State got pumped up to 5.5. That's come back down to 4. A lot of push and pull in the market here so far this week.
Yeah, a lot of it, I think, has to do with the Circa. The Circa's numbers, they're the first to post now. They post early on Sunday, and they post sides and totals, which is awesome if you're out here in Vegas. And, the group there, led by Derek Stevens, who's building the new Circa Hotel, is not afraid to post some numbers out there. So people have been tacking them and moving them pretty quick, and people have been following. Just to mention, you mentioned UCF and Nebraska. I have my power rating of Nebraska at 14. That didn't shock me. If you remembered last week, we talked on the show, I said UCF against Stanford was my highest power rating game of the entire season. I had UCF as almost a 19-point favorite against Stanford. So I love UCF. My power ratings this week only have UCF as a 6-point favorite. So I am on the opposite side. I've watched enough of this Pitt defense. I happened to be on Pitt Penn State under last week. This Penn State defense is legit. So UCF coming off one of their biggest games at home in their career. And then, now having that Stanford home game and now traveling to play Pitt with a tough defense on the road, on grass, it negates some of their speed. That is just, to me, a out of whack line.
Yeah, my line on that game is 6-2, so I actually feel pretty comfortable with where my number is, considering, again, I was about a touchdown off from the market in week 4, and you typically don't really want that to be the case as much as you can prevent it, but also that felt like such a massive overreaction. And look, I was on UCF last week too. It was a college play that we had in the Golden Nugget. Loved the Knights in that spot. Yeah, they played great, and they blitzed Stanford early and got out to the big lead. Dylan Gabriel looks fantastic. But we talked about this last week too. Stanford had no interest in that game. It was a Pac-12 sandwich game going all the way out to Orlando with the iffy weather forecast throughout the week. The weather wound up being fine, but they were worried that game, could be played in a monsoon, could have been very windy, could have been very rainy. They have cluster injuries on the offensive line already. Stanford had no interest in that game at all. And maybe as a corollary point, Oregon getting bet up all the way to 10.5 now. I don't think I'm going to take Stanford in that game, but this feels like it's a little bit high from an overreaction standpoint too of Stanford didn't really want to play last week. I think you have to throw that game out to some degree. I know they have plenty of problems, but that's something you want to keep in mind here too, is that not all these wins are exactly what they seem. Similarly, not all these losses are exactly what they seem either.
I agree with that thought. And again, for a guy that was on the UCF UCF side last week, you look at Stanford and you have that game sandwiched between your conference opener at USC and your home opener against your main rival in Oregon. It's a spot that's not your goal. Your goal is to win the Pac-12. Listen, you're not a championship team, but my power rating has the game at 10.5. I've talked about Stanford numerous times, how I thought they were completely overrated to be ranked in the beginning of the year. They were a team that got outgained last year. They got outgained by 29 yards per game. You're a 9-win team and you got outgained. You take out Walker Little, the left tackle, who's going to be a top 10 or top 12 pick in the draft. You add in some more O-line injuries this week, and even though Costello's back, if I had to bet a side, I would bet Oregon, but I'm certainly not going to bet a side. And here's a note. Let's remember, Stanford 9-0 ATS, their last 9 as a home dog.
Well, and my number's 9 on this game, so I was a little bit closer to where the opener is. And, part of it, too, may be, I don't know what Oregon's at this point in time because they haven't played anybody since that Week 1 game against Auburn where they gave that game up in the fourth quarter. So maybe I'm not giving Oregon enough respect because they didn't have the Week 1 result that they were looking for. But that's part of the equation here, too. And there are a lot of games like this, and I touched on some of them on Monday's show with Kyle Hunter, looking at Utah and USC game on Friday, for example. Utah played BYU, weren't very good in that game, won it, haven't played anybody since. USC, 3 really tough games for them here so far this season. Maybe that's something we got to factor in here this week where, Oregon, after that Auburn game, they took out a bunch of frustration on Nevada, and then I can't even remember who they played last week. Stanford's played actual teams. So that's part of the equation here, too, of can these teams get up to game speed when maybe they haven't played anybody the last 2 or 3 weeks?
Yeah, Oregon, I'm going to put it in quotation marks, only beat Montana 35-3, but they really emptied their bench at halftime. It was 21-0. They had a 277 to 95-yard edge at the half, and the defense was handling Montana. Montana only had 12 first downs. But I'll also mention this. In college basketball, we talk about strength of schedule often. We don't really mention it, early like you said in football. The week before, when they beat Nevada 77-6, Nevada was in a situation, and Nevada obviously is a team I cover closely being out here. Nevada was a team that was off a Purdue win, had Weber State, UTEP, Hawaii, San Jose State on deck, knew that they were looking at a 5-1 start. Nevada was the team 2 weeks ago when they went to Oregon that wasn't interested. They sat 4 starters that were banged up just because Jay Norville knew he wasn't going to beat Oregon off a loss to Auburn. Why go ahead and risk guys that are banged up? Let's go ahead and get blown out 77-6. Let's take our 5-1 record, and when we go to Utah State down the road and worry about winning the Mountain West. So oftentimes we think the Power 5 team is a team that may look past the team. Hey, it works in reverse as well.
Well, that's an excellent point. Absolutely love that point there, talking about Nevada. And, hey, that's definitely part of the equation here, too, because there are some games that you're probably not going to win. Look at Miami of Ohio this week. Chuck Martin with an elite-level quote about this game against Ohio State. He goes, it's like we're going out for recess, and they have the first 85 picks. So, again, that's a Miami of Ohio team that knows, well, we're not going to win. So, what's the point of putting anybody at risk? So it's an excellent point there by you. And it's it's sort of a good segue into the first game I want to talk about here, Michigan and Wisconsin, because Michigan got tested by Army. Whether they should have or shouldn't have, we don't really need to debate that here on the show. But Wisconsin has played 2 games. They've given up 0 points. And they've scored 110 because they've played USF, who's awful, and Central Michigan, who's a bottom 15 team in everybody's power ratings. So is Wisconsin going to be ready here for the Wolverines? That's the big question I have about this game.
Well, I'm going to argue that Middle Tennessee and Army is not that far off from UCF, what Wisconsin's played. We think Wisconsin's played that much of an easier schedule, but, I'm not, maybe 10 points better the other 2 teams are. Michigan, I watched some of the Army game, and, they went to this new offense. They made some tweaks, and Shea Patterson's going to throw the ball more, and, he's throwing it 58 times for only 62% against 2 weak defenses at home. I tweeted out a stat last night, Adam, which caught me by surprise. The last time Michigan won a game straight up as an underdog was 2013 against Northwestern. They're 0-13 straight up their last 13 as a dog. That's amazing that you have this, because they're not a big dog very often. Yeah, they might have been a touchdown dog to Ohio State, but every other game is at 2, 3, and 4 point range. So they've lost 13 straight. That concerns me. The Wisconsin team that has won 4 straight in the series. Michigan has lost 6 straight against the spread. You got Camp Randall, and Shea Patterson is an experienced quarterback. But, the Michigan D-line, you can't look at 200 yards against Army and say it was a bad performance, because they only allowed 3.3 yards per carry and 243 total yards. But to me, I still have to pass the eye test. Yes, Wisconsin blew out 2 foes, but, if that USF game was closer, we might say, hey, USF's not that bad, and you had to go on the road to do it down in Florida in the heat and humidity, where Michigan has played 2 foes. Yes, maybe a little better with Army being the best of the 4 teams, but they played 2 at home and now making their first road trip.
What is your number on this game?
As I look for it, I am going to I have Wisconsin 5.
Okay. Now, I have Wisconsin -1.5. And maybe you can shed some light on this, because I'm not exactly sure. I looked up the Golden Nugget Game of the Year lines back in, I think it was the end of May that those came out. Michigan was a 5-point favorite with the opener. Did that move on Wisconsin? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I'm looking right now. In my preseason power ratings, actually in my August ratings right before the season, if this game were played now, my power ratings would have Michigan 3.
Okay.
So I have Michigan down 3, and I have Wisconsin up 5 since the start of the year. Hence the huge difference in the line.
Because that's what I was wondering is, how much we've kind of looked at these first 2 weeks and have evaluated and moved these teams. Because, again, I don't think anybody expected Wisconsin to be a 3.5-point home favorite in this game, coming into the season. So, that's what's always so interesting here about having the look-ahead lines for comparison purposes, being able to go back to your summer power ratings. I print off my power ratings every week, and I've got a binder that I keep them in so that I can see, going into the summer, where did I have this game compared to where I have it now? So I think that's kind of important to be able to do to, maybe take away some of that overreaction. Now, of course, on the other hand, we have 3 data points for some of these teams. So, maybe our preseason thoughts were incorrect. But that was one that I was really surprised by, to see an 8.5-point adjustment from where this line was over the summer.
Well, let's put it this way, though. I'm going to look at it as a different perspective. And I can tell you I am guilty of this, and I'm sure 98% of the country is guilty as this. We saw Michigan last year lose 3 games. At Notre Dame, not a bad loss. At Ohio State, not a bad loss. And the Florida game, which they weren't interested in. With who they returned, with who I perceived as the best quarterback in the Big Ten with Shea Patterson, I said, there's no way Michigan can't get better. So, stats tell us one thing, but you go back and you look, Michigan's failed to cover 6 straight games now. Maybe it is the same old Jim Harbaugh. So, your power ratings are based on what you perceive a team, how much a team is going to improve. Maybe we just jumped the gun and gave Jim Harbaugh too much credit.
It's certainly possible, and it's hard to say that he deserves a whole lot of credit right now for exactly the reason you mentioned earlier. 13 straight losses as a dog for Michigan, and of course, as we all know, haven't beaten Ohio State under Harbaugh. So, we'll see if the Wolverines are able to get that win here this weekend and maybe change the narrative a little bit as they look ahead to that big game coming up Thanksgiving weekend. How about game 349, 350 here? Washington and BYU. And this is one of the most fascinating handicaps of the week for me, because I have not been all that impressed with Washington here thus far. Obviously, the loss at home to Cal, not a good look. I had Washington both personally and in the Nugget. Expected that game to go a lot differently than it did. For BYU, Utah, Tennessee, USC, Washington. For a fringy Power 5 team, I know they're an independent team, but they kind of have Power 5 level talent for the most part. That's a grueling 4-week stretch. So how much do the Cougars have left in the tank?
Well, I'll tell you what. Let's expand that grueling schedule by saying overtime against Tennessee and overtime against Utah. Now, overtime against Tennessee and overtime last week against USC. That makes it even twofold tougher coming off back-to-back emotional overtime games. Now, I will say this. There's not many teams that have been off back-to-back overtime games. It doesn't happen that often. Since 2010, teams at home off back-to-back overtime games are 8-2 against the spread. Nothing I expected at all. I expected to see a negative number playing that extra period in 2 straight games. But again, a small sample size, but it's not a small sample size because I cherry-picked. It's going back to 2010. It's just a small sample size because it's an event that doesn't occur. Now, BYU is a team that I had an asterisk next to in this season. And really, it goes back to last year. Satake, no question, was on the hot seat coming into the season. But if you look back to last year, and this is one of the notes that I wrote in my guide mid-season reading the Salt Lake City Tribune last year, Satake midway through the season said this: listen, guys, we got to play for the future. He started pulling guys that were going to graduate and didn't start them. He started playing all as true freshmen. He started playing as redshirt freshmen down the stretch. Yes, they took their lumps against Northern Illinois and Boise and Utah. Yes, they beat UMass and New Mexico State. But this team returned 17 starters and even had much more experience than that. You add in a quarterback now, Zach Wilson, who was, a top 8 quarterback coming out of high school at BYU. Those are quarterbacks that go to Ohio State and Georgia and Alabama and Clemson. Zach Wilson is a high-ranking quarterback. And you add in, they have their home edge back. You're playing a physical team that has altitude, that is home for a second straight against a Washington team. My power ratings actually have this game at pick. BYU schedule, though, even though that stat I said about the back-to-back overtime games, BYU schedule has been so daunting that even though I have a 6-point difference in my power rating, if I were making a line, there's 2 different things. What's your power rating and what you would make the line at? My clean power rating is pick. I would make the line BYU 3.5. So really I'm only a field goal away from the line and not a full 6.5 points away.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. You make your power rating line and then you factor in the situations and all the different stuff that's in play here with this game. My number is Washington -5, and I'm not particularly high on Washington. As I mentioned there at the top, they have played 3 games in altitude the last 5 years, twice in Salt Lake City, once in Boulder. So at least they're semi-accustomed to it, I guess. But I will say this. I'm really hoping BYU wins this game outright, goes to overtime again, or covers the number and loses by a short price, because I really want a good number to fade them next week when they have to go and play at the Glass Bowl in Toledo, which is a brutal spot for them, traveling 2/3 of the way across the country, essentially, after the first 4 games that they played. I will have Toledo circled, and I will be following this game in hopes I can get a good number on the Rockets.
Yeah, and Toledo not in the best scheduling spot because, they're going out and playing some altitude as well this week, playing Colorado State. And then they have their MAC opener against Western Michigan. It's also homecoming the following week. So, but again, anytime we know, if you follow Toledo football history, going back to the days when Power 5 teams came into the Glass Bowl, it really was a special setting. Last year they sort of faltered against Miami of Florida, but that game got away from them early, and they just couldn't play catch up at all. So I agree, totally agree with you. The scheduling spot, Adam. I think that's a great point.
I didn't realize it was a tough spot for Toledo. I knew they were coming off the altitude game, but Western Michigan the following week, those 2 teams have a little bit of a history too. So, again, a lot of things to consider here in the college football market, to say the least. Let's go to game 367, 368 real quick, and then we'll talk some NFL to finish out the segment. Auburn and Texas A&M. A&M, a 4-point favorite in College Station. Big true road spot here for Bo Nix and Auburn. How you seeing this one?
Yeah, you look at the technicals, and the technicals are all over A&M in this game. A&M has turned into the new moneymaker from Fresno. 16-4 against the spread their last 20 games. 7-0-2 ATS as a home favorite. 8-0-2 ATS at home. And then you look at Auburn on the flip side. They're 2-7 as a away dog. You got a true freshman making his first road start. Yeah, he has a lot of experience, playing in Dallas with a split crowd that helps. But, hey, in that Dallas game, he went 13 of 32. What concerns me about Bo Nix is against Tulane at home, he went 19 of 37, a game that they struggled, turned the ball over, and just couldn't punch it in. They only totaled 379 yards. Last week against Kent State, he only had to throw the ball 17 times, 13 of 17. I mean, they rushed for almost 500 yards, so you can't even count that game in. But I will look to fade Bo Nix here in a legitimate road spot. The O-line, you have some O-line people banged up for Auburn. That's going to be another issue. And I think it's a legitimate spot here where the Aggies now, Kellen Mond made a mistake or two at Clemson. We know that. He's made a mistake or two in the past. But, he at home, he's been dynamite, and I don't expect him to be anything different. Last year at home, he threw 60% with a 19-4 ratio. On the road, he was 54% with a 4-4 ratio. I don't know if I'm going to pull the trigger to be on A&M, but they are clearly in my mix and made my first cut down as I continue to evaluate teams for this weekend.
All right, so as we transition over to the NFL side of things here, some definite talking points to discuss, and we discussed a lot of them in the previous segment with Brian Blessing. But, Rolf, I just want to get your take on, what we've seen so far, what your initial thoughts are about some of these teams here in the NFL.
Well, I think that, Miami's Miami. I think we're going to have the worst team in the history of the NFL, and we're going to see teams take advantage. Trading their cornerback to Pittsburgh last night shows how much they're in the tank for Tua, or I don't know if they want Herbert or whoever they can pick now. I think it's a situation that I wouldn't even be surprised if they traded one of their quarterbacks with all these injuries coming. The things that jump out at me, we're going to talk about this game, Lamar Jackson, his historic start to the season. I think that right now, Dallas to me seems like the best team in the NFC. Dak Prescott is getting a lot of love, but I just love, there's very few teams where you can say very good quarterback, superstar running back, superstar wide receiver, a tight end, a top 8 defense. I think they have it all. New England's defense. Bill Belichick is his own DC again for the first time in 4 years. And boy, can you tell, shutting out Miami, 3 points against Pittsburgh. Even in the preseason, he was blitzing like crazy, calling his own plays. I think he had 8 sacks against Detroit in the preseason opener, which is crazy if you're looking at Bill Belichick numbers. And I think, we got to mention the Browns since I'm from Cleveland and you're from Cleveland. Boy, if they can ever play clean, they have potential to be a very good team. Getting that road win and covering for the first time as an away favorite since 2014 was a big deal last night. Yeah, you could say you were playing a number 2 and then number 3 quarterback, but to me that doesn't matter. I mean, going on the road and learning how to win is one thing. Going on the road, learning how to win and cover is another thing. Myles Garrett is just a beast. If he would stop jumping off sides, he'd be great. And again, now what do we look at with 3 quarterbacks out already, and we're in for a hell of a season.
Well, let's go ahead and throw out some news that's just coming across the wire now on Twitter that Cam Newton's probably not going to play on Sunday. So there's another quarterback down. Aggravated a foot injury against Tampa Bay, which, I mean, look, that's fine. I get it. But also, that was Thursday night last week. Nothing was said up until now. that, Cam Newton, and look, he didn't look himself. We all knew that anyway, but still, you would think that something would have come out a little bit earlier, but in any event now, Carolina, Arizona off the board until we find out exactly what's going on with Cam Newton, who once again didn't really look himself anyway. But that game that you mentioned that we're going to talk about here, game 465, 466, Baltimore and Kansas City. I think this is one of those games people may have been surprised with the 6.5 opener, and yet this line's going up anyway.
Well, again, I never tweet negative things, but I had to jump out and say, before we anoint Lamar Jackson, let's remember he played probably what's historically going to be one of the worst teams ever in the history of the NFL week 1. Week number 2, since 2009, no team in the NFL was outgained by more yards last year than the Arizona Cardinals. Arizona Cardinals were outgained by 117 yards per game. That was the worst in the NFL since the 2009 Browns. So you played a historically bad team week 1. You played a team that was the worst team in the NFL in week number 2 in the last 10 years. And now week number 3, you're going to play the team that was number 31 in defense last year. So, until he faces Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and Seattle and New England, let's just hold off until we anoint him. With that said, though, he is playing the Chiefs' defense. The Chiefs are fading as a home favorite because that defense is not very good. Patrick Mahomes, watching him against the Oakland Raiders, the passes he can make to a sideline, dropping that ball on a dime, are some of the best I've ever seen. To me, they're like kids that bully someone and play for 5 minutes and then screw around, and then if they need to score a few more, they play strong for a few minutes. They scored 4 touchdowns in 1 quarter and didn't do anything the rest of the time. High scoring game, but the only way for me to go is the over, because you look at Baltimore, it's very, very difficult to go to Kansas City as a young quarterback and play. There's history that goes back and says Arrowhead, when you have young quarterbacks is tough, but Lamar Jackson has the advantage of having gone there last year. That's the only game he's lost as a starter. And yeah, they lost that game, but they only lost 27-24. Jackson was only 13 of 26 for 123 yards. But he can say, hey, listen, I went in there 8 games ago. I know we only lost by 3 to a Kansas City team that was much better than us. I have confidence because of that 3-point loss. So that makes me think he's going to be able to move the ball. If Casey's forced to keep up the tempo on offense, even though it's a high total, I lean with the over.
Yeah, I mean, there was only one way that this total was going to go, and up was the way it was going to go, because also Baltimore with some pretty significant injuries in the secondary. Jimmy Smith, I think he's out for a few more weeks here. I know he was just ruled out last week, and he's got a little bit of an injury concern. So that's a Baltimore secondary that's kind of ravaged by injuries a little bit. It's too bad you can't play totals in these super contests and circa million, although everybody would be on the over in this game. Makes sense. As you said, I mean, Lamar Jackson, you think about it last year, the only defense that really slowed him down considerably was the Chargers the second time that he played them. And he's had a berry patch of defenses to play against. So I do want to see what happens with him as we go forward here, as they play some better teams. But like you said, this week ain't it. I mean, Kansas City is one of those teams where if they don't get to the quarterback with the pass rush, they give up big chunk yards. And you're not going to get to a guy like Lamar Jackson because he's just too mobile. So I think this one is a shootout. Maybe last team with the ball wins kind of scenario. Sounds like you do like Baltimore a little bit, based on Jackson and how things went against Kansas City last year. So interesting game. I mean, one thing I will say is this. We talk a lot about teasers. We'll talk about them again on tomorrow's show with Brian Leonard. But, yeah, I know Kansas City's a 6.5 or a 7-point favorite. You generally don't want to tease games that are total in the mid-50s.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And when you have more scoring, you have more opportunities. There's a reason those games are in the 50 because you have a high flying offense, and one team can make a run, and a couple turnovers can lead to a blowout because one team's going to keep up the pace. And something else I looked up, and it really surprised me. On the show, we've talked about double-digit favorites in the NFL, how well they've done over the past few years, and I'm looking it up as we speak. But I was surprised how little or how much a benefit it was. Someone reached out to me on Twitter and said, hey, these 12, 13, 14, 15-point favorites, is it good for me to get them down? We talk about 3 and 7, but is it good to get 16 or 17 down to 11? Does that help? And normally when you tease a game, you have about a 22% difference from an ATS number to a teaser number. Well, I'm going back since 2014, and we're going to see a lot more 14-point spreads this year because of Miami and because of some teams that are just going to get crushed. If you look back since 2014, NFL teams that are a 14-point favorite have gone 22-9, 71% against the spread. If you tease that 14-point favorite down to 8, you only went 24-7, 77% against the spread. So you're getting 6 extra points. You're paying that huge teaser price. You cover 71% against the spread. When you tease a favorite of 14 or more, you're only covering 77%, a 6.4% difference. That's it.
Interesting numbers to be sure there. And again, teasers they're called that for a reason. So you definitely want to be careful with the teams that you're selecting for those. One more game I want to talk about specifically, and then I just want to get your take on the 2 games that have lines of 3 touchdowns or more. Atlanta and Indianapolis. This looks like a good one. What about this line move? Indianapolis was a 2.5 or so point favorite at the open. This line has taken almost all Atlanta money down to 1 at Pinnacle, pick at some places, 2 at others, but it's still early on in the week here. You agree with Atlanta taking the money here?
I do. Granted, Indy could have, should have won against the Chargers. They were still a team that couldn't get it done because of Adam Vinatieri. They only had 288 yards against Tennessee, be it on the road as well. They got the win, but scoring 19 points. I have trouble thinking they're going to be able to score enough to keep up with Atlanta. Ryan didn't look great against the Philly defense early, and the Philly defense was banged up on Sunday night. But you're facing a Jim Schwartz team that just all out blitzed you. I mean, very few teams are going to do that. Ryan threw the ball 43 times. Heck, he's thrown the ball 86 times in 2 games at Minnesota and Philly. To me, that means I think you're going to be ready. He's completing 72%. He's not losing anything by playing in the dome. You're a dome team playing in the dome. That gives you a little bit of an advantage. You've outgained both of your foes by 76 and 81 yards. If it comes down to Vinatieri, if Vinatieri misses any more this week, I'm sure, even though he's a namesay in the Colts, if it costs them the game, I'm sure they have to jettison him for a new kicker. Be it, though, back at home, I don't expect him to falter. But I just have trouble. Atlanta's played Minnesota and Philly, 2 very good defenses. Even though Indy's got an average defense to above average to me, I think it's the weakest opponent they faced moving forward, and I just don't see the Colts scoring enough to keep up with the Falcons.
All right, so the last thing I'll ask you about here on today's show, New England is favored by anywhere from 22.5 to 23.5. Dallas favored by anywhere from 21 to 21.5. I know that this has never happened before with 2 favorites in the 20s, but what do you make of all this, Rolf?
Well, we have very good teams and we have very bad teams. I'm looking going back to 1989, so 30 years. In 30 years, I have 18 teams in the database that have been a favorite of 18 or more, and they are 18-0 straight up, no surprise there. 6-12 against the spread, 33%. And if you look at the teams that are minus 21 or more, they're 0-5 against the spread. So we have 2 this week in 19 and 11. In 30 NFL seasons, we've only had 5 favorites of 21 or higher, and we have 2 this week. So they're 0-5 against the spread. I would tend to bet against them. And yeah, you could say I was on the Patriots under against Miami. Double-digit dogs are now 4-25 over/under. That's been an angle that's been money. And the Patriots had the issue of going to Miami, losing back-to-back times and losing 5 of the last 6 times. This Patriots team was special. They had 2 minutes to go on the clock. Edelman gets hurt. He goes out. The trainer looks at his eye and his face. And they send Edelman back in up 36-0, and they score another touchdown to go up 43-0. The Patriots wanted to pound Miami last week. That's the difference. Moving forward, I don't know if the Cowboys have that animosity towards the Dolphins. And, yeah, the Patriots and the Jets are in the same division again. But the Jets are at least going to try. Miami doesn't try to win. If Le'Veon can keep some possessions away from Brady and just do enough to win, to keep it close, I would not play either favorite in that role.
Ralph Michaels, professional handicapper over at wagertalk.com. What's going on over there right now, man?
Well, I'm an old timer. People know that. And every Monday now I post a couple things at Wager Talk. If you want a one-page college football schedule to print off, write down notes, write down your bets, write down line moves, I have it with the Sunday circa lines and totals. So for those that want to follow line moves, if you go to Wager Talk, go to my page, you could print off the college page, and boom, you can have those lines. On my NFL one-page schedule, I list the look-ahead lines from the Superbook. The look-ahead lines went 3-2 this past week. Those are the lines that the Superbook puts out the week before the games, and you could see how much of an overreaction or adjustment there was after Sunday's game. So the college line has the circa Sunday morning sides and totals. The NFL schedule has the look-ahead lines. My power ratings are on there, and Adam, you talked about always remembering what your opening power rating is. If you go to my power rating report, I have them listed alphabetically, and I have them listed by conference, and I also list every week what my moves were and what the opening numbers were, so you exactly know how much I thought a team was better at the beginning of the season than they are now, or vice versa. WagerTalk.com, go to the Ralph Michaels page, and you're all set.
Lots of good information over there at Wager Talk and also on Ralph's Twitter account at CalSportsLV. Ralph, appreciate the time as always, man. Thank you so much for joining me. Talk to you again next week.
Looking forward to it, Adam. See you.